Hello students, and welcome to our discussion, this narrated PowerPoint about transitions for your Speech 1113 class. I chose this graphic because there's obviously a transitional landscape here between the forest and the river and this majestic mountain. Transitions are very important in both public speaking and in your English classes. There's two types of transitions, however, that are used in a speech class. First is the verbal, and those are the actual words that a speaker uses to connect ideas. And the second is a physical transition, or the nonverbal movement that a speaker engages in to communicate a transition. We're going to discuss both of these different types of transitions. When I was a child, we were all told that we would have cars that flew. And I remember thinking that by the time I was an adult, that a vehicle such as the one you see displayed on your computer screen right now would be a reality, and that we would be there by the time I was old enough to drive. That of course is not the case, and we have yet to make such a transition between driving around on asphalt and skirting around in the air in a flying automobile. Occasionally, however, you do see some news accounts of flying automobiles, but they typically tend to look a lot less like this one and a lot more like this one. And that is not necessarily the sort of transitional vehicle that I was looking for. However, I did do some searching around on the internet, and we are actually closer to this than you might think. And it involves kind of a metaphor, a visual metaphor, for what we're going to talk about in today's lecture, and that's a transition. And in fact, this is called the transition from Terra Fuga, and here you see it driving down the road as an automobile. There you see it parked at an airport. They drove it to the airport. It's getting ready to become a plane. There you see it in the transitional process of folding out its wings. And there you see it taking off for flight. And that vehicle is a great metaphor for what we're talking about. Somehow you've got to move your speech along from this place, which is one of the main points, to this place, which is another one of the main points. And to do that, you've got to move along, you've got to set yourself up, and then you can finally transition to whatever it is that you hope to become. Let's talk first about verbal words that communicate. Think about logical relationship between ideas or main points that you're trying to connect. Explore transitions that help you communicate those relationships. Remember your primary organizational patterns that we've discussed in our class, and those are chronological, spatial, topical, cause and effect, and various other persuasive organizational patterns. Let's talk about chronological. You may want to communicate a sequence or an order in your transition words. You can use words like first, second, third, next, then, and finally. You may want to communicate time in your transition words. You could use words like after, afterward, at last, before, currently, during, earlier, immediately, later, meanwhile, now, recently, simultaneously, subsequently, and then. All of those things indicate a chronological or time-based organizational pattern. Next, let's talk about some transitional words that indicate a spatial organizational pattern. If you're trying to describe place or position, you could use words like above, adjacent, below, beyond, here, in front, in back, nearby, there. All of those things indicate that spatial organizational pattern. Next, you might try to communicate things that are organized in a topical sort of situation or a topical organizational pattern. You could use words like similarity, things that demonstrated contrast, things that demonstrated elaboration or example, and finally things that demonstrated an emphasis. Let's look first at similarity. Also, in the same way, just as, so too, likewise, similarly, as opposed to contrast. But, however, in spite of, on the other hand, nevertheless, notwithstanding, in contrast, in contrary, still, yet, elaboration or example, for instance, namely, specifically, to illustrate, or emphasis, even, indeed, in fact, of course, and truly. Next, let's look at persuasive organizational patterns. You have things like cause and effect. You might use words like accordingly, consequently, hence, so, therefore, and thus. You also have words that indicate additional support or evidence for a point that you're already making. Additionally, again, also, and, as well, besides, equally important, further, furthermore, in addition, moreover, and then. Then finally, for conclusions, or to signify that you're coming to a conclusion, that you're wrapping your speech up, things that indicate conclusion or summary. Finally, in a word, in brief, in conclusion, in the end, in the final analysis, on the whole, thus, to conclude, to summarize, in sum, and in summary. All of those indicate a concluding sort of relationship to the material that's come before. Next, let's talk about physical transitions. And these are things that you're going to want to do in front of the audience in order to communicate that there's a transition happening. You're going to start off and you're going to have your introduction. You're, of course, going to participate in the 4 parts of the introduction, which is your attention getter, your credibility statement, your statement of thesis, and your preview of the main points. You'll then have your first main point, and you'll want to move around a little bit. Maybe go to a different part of the room. Go to a different part of the room to explain your second main point, and yet a different part of the room to maintain or to explain that final main point. And then, of course, finally, you'll want to come back and deliver a conclusion. I have here a stick figure who is going to go through all of these different things. He, of course, started off in his introduction, did his main point, did his second point, did his third point, and then finally ends up delivering his conclusion by stepping up a little bit, lowering his voice slightly, and delivering the conclusion. So these are the things that you can do to create effective verbal and nonverbal transitions in your speeches. I hope that you learned something that will help you to deliver a better speech both in this class and in other public speaking situations that you might find yourself in the future. Remember, the plane is a metaphor. How are you going to get from the car to in the air? And the answer is that you need a transition, and you're going to need to set that transition up. And it may take you a little while to think of a good one, but eventually you will get there. Have a good day.